Let's move on to the current international agenda. Of course, we start with the situation around Ukraine. November 21, as you know, marks exactly 10 years since the start of anti-government protests on the so-called Independence Square in Kyiv. In fact, all this is really some kind of terrible grotesque. Then events set off a tragic chain that led to the current catastrophe in Ukraine. As you know, a detailed commentary on the occasion of this date was recently posted on the website of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In it, we tried to answer questions about how the so-called Euromaidan arose, who at that time was behind the scenes of all this tragicomedy, today's tragedy, and how did all this turn out for the people of Ukraine? Today I would like to touch on a very important aspect: the perception of Ukrainian citizens of what happened in those years. You remember? Then people took to the streets because they wanted change for the better. This was a natural desire, given the difficult path of development of the young state. Let me remind you that, in general, Ukraine was only in the process of democratic transition. But now the question must be formulated differently. Moreover, citizens of Ukraine ask themselves this question literally every day. Did they get what they wanted? But the answer is obvious: they didn't. The fact is that the Anglo-Saxon intelligence services and their Kyiv agents used Ukrainian citizens to achieve their own selfish goals. The so-called Euromaidan contributed to the split of society. It led to rampant nationalism. It literally blew up society. And instead of a state that was destined to gain solid foundations, legal nihilism appeared. It was precisely this that began to reign on the territory of Ukraine. All this led to a struggle with the Russian language and with common history, and, in general, with global history, to the deterioration of the socio-economic situation, to the emergence of a repressive dictatorship and civil war. Over the past 10 years, the population of Ukraine has openly said, and this is confirmed by opinion polls, that this country is moving in the wrong direction. But the authorities acted against the interests of their own people, driving them even further into foreign bondage, as is known. The formal reason for the anti-government protests in November 2013 was the decision of the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, to postpone the conclusion of the association agreement with the EU. Let me remind you that this document was signed later by the protégés of the West who seized power in Kyiv. Why did he want to delay the signing? This is because there were estimates from the expert community that this would lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian economy. Today, millions of Ukrainians actually live in the European Union, most of them as refugees, to whom local authorities are willing to pay money to return home. Ukrainian agricultural products, and a lot of attention was paid to quotas for their import into the EU 10 years ago, are now blocked at the border. Who do you think is blocking it? No, not by Russia, but by the eastern members of the European Union. But cultural values and objects of art that belong to the Ukrainian people, which should belong to them, are actively exported to Europe. Also, no matter how terrible it may sound, minor children of the people of Ukraine are being taken to this very Europe. And they are taken there unaccompanied by adults. Their further fate, I can say, is supposedly unknown, but, unfortunately, we understand what we are talking about. Where these children end up is something that not only we talk about, but now also the official structures of the European Union countries, as well as journalists from these countries. Corruption, which protesters also protested against 10 years ago, has now reached unprecedented proportions under the Zelensky regime, and before that under Poroshenko, but especially under Zelensky. Military, financial and humanitarian aid from Western countries, not to mention trenches or some kind of economic transactions, But even humanitarian aid is shamelessly stolen there. Sponsors of the Kiev regime regularly demand financial transparency, but this is already some kind of routine. It seems to me that they are doing this for their own reporting, so that later, as part of an audit, they can prove that they made efforts to curb corruption in Ukraine in order to pretend that they are not directing the money into a black hole. Of course, all this is unsuccessful. Even European officials were forced to admit, this is a direct quote, that Ukraine is a country that is corrupt at all levels of society. I don't think Ukrainians dreamed of such a future in November 2013. And I'm sure that if someone had shown them this future 10 years ago, they would have literally recoiled in horror from this very maiden. And they would have gone to work, but, unfortunately, at that time many of them thoughtlessly shouted slogans about returning Ukraine, as they said, to the European family. For the vast majority of the country's residents, that Euromaidan became a tragic point of no return to normal peaceful life. Literally crossed out confidence in the future and the rejection of such a thing as self-esteem. Because all of the above is cynically distorted by the current Kiev regime. Ukrainian militants continue to cold-bloodedly strike at the civilian population of Donbas, the Azov region, Kherson region, Belgorod, Bryansk and Kursk regions. They widely use multiple launch rocket systems supplied by NATO countries, artillery, shells, including cluster warheads, and, of course, drones. Over the past week, as a result of brutal shelling from Ukraine in the DPR, 3 people were killed and 11 people were injured, including a 4-month-old child. The Kiev regime is undertaking such bloody actions in order to show its sponsors at least some result against the background of its depressing situation on the line of military contact. Over the past week, several distinguished guests from the United States visited Kiev. Apparently, they wanted to make sure of the level of democracy achieved over 10 years. True, among them were not economists and financial analysts, but CIA Director William Burns, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Apparently, these overseas visitors came to curb Zelensky's appetites and at the same time demand from him an account of the expenditure of the huge funds allocated by the West to support the so-called summer counteroffensive, the guaranteed success of which the Kiev regime convinced its masters. But before that, they convinced the Kiev regime that this whole story would end with a convincing victory for Zelensky. Both were wrong. The head of Zelensky's office, Mr. Ermak, returned empty-handed from a trip to Washington on November 13 to 15. His attempts to reach congressmen and convince them of the need for further subsidies to the Kiev regime and the army were unsuccessful. Apparently, this is due to the deepening disagreements in American ruling circles on the issue of military and financial assistance to Kiev. But even now the United States of America has a place to spend money from its daily needs. Apparently, in the current circumstances, the United States is trying to shift the costs of maintaining Zelensky to its European satellites. Against this background, it was no coincidence that Berlin announced plans to double German military assistance to Ukraine next year, from 4 to 8 billion euros. Well, Germany is doing well economically. We talked about this last time. A total drop in all indicators of economic growth. A monstrous situation for German business in Germany. But does this really matter when the possibility of implementing Russophobia is at stake? I will simply repeat that the West must understand that with such steps they are driving themselves into a trap. They are increasingly drawn into the conflict and contribute to its escalation, an increase in the number of civilian casualties, and the destruction of their own economies, but also the destruction of societies, given those processes, which are now gaining momentum in Western Europe. No matter how the collective West tries to arm Ukraine and direct the Ukrainian authorities to continue the confrontation with Russia, these attempts are doomed to failure. We see changing rhetoric. What should they do? Before that, they said that only on the battlefield would it be determined whose truth it was and who won. Today they are not sure about this. Today they say, of course, that they believe in the victory of Ukraine, but not now, but when. They do not specify this. But I can clarify, never.